In this video, we will explore two very different approaches to the belief in God. One approach relies on the cosmological argument, which is one of the oldest philosophical arguments that attempt to prove God's existence. However, the other perspective of the problem is less sophisticated, but more subjective, which gives an interesting insight into the debate of God's existence. First, we will consider the Kalam cosmological argument. The ideas of this argument may be traced back to Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, who was one of the most prominent and influential philosophers of the Muslim Golden Age. The argument goes something like this. Everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause for its existence. An infinite regress of causes is impossible. Therefore, there exists a first uncaused eternal cause, which is God. The essence of this argument is that it tries to prove the eternity of some entity. Then it claims that this entity is God. So let's critique this causation argument one premise at a time. Most people would agree that the first premise is true. However, an objection to the argument might address the second one. Why is the assumption that the universe began to exist valid? Such a question is better answered by a cosmologist, but it is plausible theoretically to assume that the universe began to exist at the Big Bang, provided no one can know what was before it. As for the third premise, its truth follows directly from the first two. Leaving the fourth premise to the end, we can criticize the conclusion. Why not give the eternity property to the universe instead of a God? Why not claim that the cause was the Big Bang, not God? However, this question does not refute the argument per se. It is rather an objection to the label of the uncaused eternal cause. Spinoza, for example, thought the idea of God is present in nature itself, without referring to any religious God. Yet, whether you call it nature or God is not the subject of debate. In other words, we just came to the conclusion that there exists an uncaused first eternal causer, provided infinite regress is ruled out. Now let's consider the fourth premise, which alleges that an infinite regress of causes is impossible. The problem of infinite regress emerges like this. When we think about the universe as a thing, we are intuitively compelled to claim that it has a cause because everything we observe seems to be contingent. Thus, it is plausible to include the universe in the circle of contingency, which includes the whole chain of caused things. However, the circle of contingency seems to include everything, because induction forces us to draw the same conclusion about anything we could think of. But when does the chain end? Bizarrely, it seems infinite. Fair enough. But why does the cosmological argument assumes that an infinite regress of causes is not possible then? To me, and other philosophers including Aristotle, infinite regress is not accepted intuitively. However, intuition is too subjective to be a convincing reason. Therefore, by the more convenient inductive reasoning, I am compelled to assume that infinite regress is inevitable. However, the acceptance of infinite regress has some implications. For example, an infinite regress implies that the circle of contingency is eternal, because the causes stretch out to infinity. Indeed, the concept of eternity brings up a physics-based discussion about the definition of time. But this talk is so technical and theoretical that it is not relevant for this epistemological discussion. So, I will use the conventional notion of time. Further, since the argument's first premise asserts that only things that start to exist must have a cause, and since the circle of contingency turned out to be eternal, then the circle of contingency is uncaused. Accordingly, we came to the conclusion of the existence of an eternal uncaused thing, whether we endorse infinite regress or reject it. Consequently, we have to accept the idea of an eternal uncaused thing. In this frame of reference, the idea of religious gods as eternal uncaused things is plausible because attributing the title of uncaused eternal thing to the circle of contingency is the same as attributing the same title to a god, since the concept is already acceptable in the first place. As for the polar opposite of a philosophical argument, we will consider the thoughts of the Danish philosopher Soren Kierkegaard, who has a very interesting point of view on the subject of believing in God. Kierkegaard believed in God because he just felt like it. He wrote in a book of his, "To have faith is to lose your mind and win God. One must admire Kierkegaard's courage to give up on logical reasoning despite being a revolutionary philosopher. He just let his heart and intuition decide where the truth lies. Fascinatingly, Kierkegaard proposed a scenario that somewhat may explain why he and numerous other theists refused logic and reason in favor of faith. He proposed the story of a madman. One day, a madman escapes from an asylum planning to never go back to this terrible place. Then he realizes that if he talked to people like he always did, they would discover that he is mad and return him to the asylum. Therefore, he decided to tell people the most real and true thing he could think of. He decided whenever he met someone to say, "The earth is round." After a while, people realized he was mad and sent him back to the asylum. So, how to relate this story to the belief in God without reason? The idea is that although the madman told people an uncontroversial truth, he didn't consider the context in which this truth is relevant. Similarly, a lot of people have the tendency to follow their intuition, despite the opposing arguments presented by others. Therefore, the madman in the story resembles those who try to reason their way to God, because rationality might not get you very far. So for Kierkegaard, believing in God doesn't require reason. All it needs is a leap of faith.